Hello, everybody, and welcome back. I hope that you had a wonderful lunch if you're at all on our time zone here, the East Coast. My wife was making pumpkin spice scones, so not to make anybody jealous, but there you go. I am here to introduce our next speaker, who is Michael Burns. Michael is a teaching minister in the Dallas-Fort Worth church area. Also the co-host of the Icon podcast, the All Things to All People podcast. He taught high school history in the central city of Milwaukee for nearly 10 years before graduating from Wesley Seminary at Indiana Wesleyan University. He is a national and international Bible teacher at churches, schools of mission, workshops. He's authored many books, some of them being Crossing the Line, All Things to All People. My personal favorite actually this physical copy sits on my favorite shelf. If you're sitting on my physical favorite shelf, that means you are high on my favorite shelf. That is one of my favorite books right there, Escaping the Beast. And he and his wife have two adult sons. When I think of Michael, one word that came to mind was just the word leadership in all these positive ways. Michael serves in a leadership role in congregational shepherding pastoral life, and he's that kind of a leader. Michael brings a sense of scholarship and leadership together. He's served on teaching teams and committees. He's written books. He's done all kinds of beautiful things there. I think of leadership in terms of prophetic leadership. A lot of what I feel like Michael has contributed to the conversation has been well, the title of his book, Crossing the Line. Like there's a way to play it easy and then a way to use voice and influence prophetically. And he has done that many times in ways that I deeply appreciate. But I mean, I go over to his website, michaelburnsteachingministry.com. I see books, I see ebooks, I see curriculum, I see audiobooks, I see podcasts. I know he's working on projects right now. Just Michael uses his gifts in such a way to bless us immensely. I remember meeting Michael. I've gotten a chance to meet him digitally a couple times in person, at least once. And he's always been very gracious, generous, hospitable, treated me as one of his peers. And I deeply appreciated that in a lot of ways. But when all is said and done, there's an even bigger word that I think of when I think of Michael, and that is believer. I don't mean that in the way you think I mean. I mean, he's a fellow Sasquatch enthusiast. And that is where I will end this introduction. Everybody, join me in welcoming Michael Burns. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marty. We do have that in common. We share that affinity, the love of the Sasquatch believing community. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the introduction. I'm really grateful to be here with you all today, and to Image Bearers and Atoma for arranging this. I'm grateful for that. I'm not as grateful that Atoma had me follow Marty Solomon. You don't really ever want to be in that position. So I'm happy that at least we had a lunchtime buffer in between there, so I didn't have to come on right after Marty. But I do want to pick up, I think, in some ways where Marty left off. And I really appreciate what Marty had to say in setting the stage. And so I was asked to talk to you today basically about everything we need to know about image bearing from the New Testament perspective. And so that is exactly what we're going to accomplish in the next 60 minutes or so. I joke, of course, we're not going to look at everything that we could say about image bearing. We're just going to look at a very small sliver of it, but hopefully it gets us in that right direction of some of the important things that we do need to know. And, you know, that's really one of the areas that we wrestle with a lot, is what does God want from us? What is God's will even? so to speak. I hear that language in Christian circles a lot. And I would start off right away by saying I think we often have a misguided approach to what God's will is, or how it plays out in our lives as Christians. And what I mean is this. Excuse me. So, for example, my wife loves Starbucks. Now, that's foreign to me. I don't drink coffee. I don't like coffee. I don't like the way coffee smells, but I wind up every so often being the delivery guy for Starbucks. I go and pick it up or whatever. And so there's a couple different ways that I can be sent to Starbucks. Every now and then I'll be out and I'll get a text, hey, pick me up this, and I'll get the exact order. And I'm glad for exact order because it makes it easier. She often orders some triple frappe latte, iced over caramel, something or other, macchiato. I don't know, whatever it is, but it's complicated. And so if I get it exactly written out, that makes it easy. And I appreciate that. Then every now and then it's like, hey, pick me up something from Starbucks. Just get something that I would like. That's actually terrifying because I don't remember any of that stuff. I don't pay as close attention as I should to details like that. So the just, get me what I want sort of thing or what I like is very disconcerting and extremely problematic for me. And it leaves me in like this moment of like, oh my goodness, what does she want? And I'm looking at the menu and I'm like, I don't know. I could just order coffee, but I know that's not right. And so I don't know what to order. Now, there's a third option, I suppose. I'm still waiting for this to happen. But where, let's say I get a text that says, you know what? I feel like Starbucks. Get me anything from there. I'll be happy with that. I'll enjoy whatever you pick. I'll be happy with. Now, I say that to say I think those three options give us a bit of a window into how we can approach what God wants from us. There is the approach of, that feels safer and more comfortable, which is just, I wish God would just tell us exactly what to do. Just give me a list of rules and orders, and then we can carry it out and be obedient. And some of us even approach the Bible as though it's written that way. And it's not, of course. We're then turning it into the book we want instead of the book we have, which is, as Marty so eloquently laid out, it's a narrative that we are to live into. But then a lot of us reduce it to that second option, which is the terrifying one. Get what I want, do what I want, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. And that's how we tend to approach our individual lives and even our lives as Christians, is what is God's will? We got to figure it out. I'm praying for it. I'm searching for it. Is it God's will that I take this role or do this job or marry this person or move to this city? And if I make the wrong decision, then, oh my goodness, I went outside of God's will maybe, and now God's not happy with me. And so we're in this constant stress situation of trying to figure out what God's will is. And if I'm being honest, that is how the pagans approached their relationship with the gods in the ancient world. It was all about what is the will of the gods. We got to define it. We got to figure it out. We've got to do all these ceremonies and casting lots and dice and bones and reading, different omens and all of that to figure out what is the will of the gods and make sure that they're happy and not angry with you. And that tends to be how we can often think of God's will, as though he's playing some hide and seek game with us, as though I've got to figure out in each situation what it is. And if I make the wrong choice or we make the wrong choice, then God's not going to be happy. But I think what we actually see is God has laid out his will pretty clearly in the New Testament for us as his people. And it's much more like that third scenario. There's a parameter. Please go to Starbucks. Don't go to Dunkin' and get some garbage from there. Don't go to Caribou. Don't go to the gas station. Go to Starbucks, but give me anything from Starbucks. And so God has kind of laid out some parameters for his will. And then the rest of it is for us to use our creative imaginations and lean into that story and look at the wisdom that came before us of how God's people lived out the truth of that narrative arc and how we are then to live it out. So I want to look at that a little bit here this afternoon. And I want to actually start, even though we're talking about the New Testament, I do want to start in Genesis just for a minute with the idea of image bearing. And at the apex of Genesis 1, of the account of God ordering creation for his people, it's part of that preface section that Marty talked about. We see that it says that God made human being in his image. Now, we don't have a ton of time to go into all the details, but there are some things that I want to say about that. And it's interesting because I think it's important to understand that in the context of the counter narrative that this is providing. And I think, Marty talked about that a little bit. And in fact, he said that God wrote the preface in part to reframe our understanding of the world. And that is precisely what we see going on here, because being in the image of a god or of the divine or of the gods was a pretty well-known concept in the ancient world. And certainly by the time that Genesis is written. And so Genesis is a pretty radical reframing of the idea of the image of the gods, because those who were image bearers were a limited number. Image bearing was about usually about building up the state, building up the power of empire. And there was a very few. It was the king or maybe some priests or some nobles, the very high up people, the highest people. They were the ones that represented the authority of the gods, the presence of the god, the nature, the character. That's what image bearing was. It was that representative. And so it was just this small group of mighty men, not really women. Men were pretty much exclusively the image of the gods. And so it was about state. It was about status and hierarchy. It was about telling the story of the empire, that they were powerful, that they had these powerful men that represented them, and they were the image bearers. And so Genesis reframes that in profound ways. Number one, what we see in the Genesis account in that preface is that the idea of image bearing, there's really three important aspects to it. One is it is about community. We don't get the more individualized, zeroed in angle of creation until the next chapter. In Genesis 1, where it's talking about image bearing, it just generically talks about humanity, human beings, male and female. And so there's a fundamental concept to image bearing of, yes, we as individuals we do image God, but it is a community function. It reflects the nature of God, the communal, relational nature of God, all of that. Number two is what we see in Genesis is that image bearing is deeply about equality. It's not just limited to a king or a noble or an Ish Gadol or the great warrior or leader. It's every human being. Male, female, high status, low status, whoever it is, every single person can take part in this community of image bearing, which is so profound. The third thing I think we see there is like image bearing anywhere else. It is a reflection of the character, the will, the purposes, the authority, the function, all of that of God. And so what we see when we put that all together is that in the call to be image bearing, which is what it means to be human. Image bearing is not necessarily something we do, it's what we are, it's what we are created to be. So to be human is to be an image bearer. That's our calling, that's our vocation as humans. And putting that all together, it means that the way God designed creation is for us to be community that is an equal relationship with one another, that we don't have the dynamics of power over and of status and of hierarchy and those sorts of things. But instead, we are a community that by that equality, by the way we interact with one another as equals on equal ground, as a level ground, we tell the truth about God. Now, and I'm not saying with our mouths here, but I'm saying by the way we live, the image bearing community tells the truth about who God is, about the nature of God. And so it's really important to consider the dynamics that we use as an image bearing community. Are we a community that tells the truth about God? Do people look and know the truth about the nature and character and purposes of God based on how we live? So we see this idea then of community as an important aspect of image bearing throughout the narrative of the Old Testament. That is what God is doing. That's his solution to rebellion. In fact, in Genesis 3, where we see the idea of true image bearing being questioned, the serpent comes in and challenges. Not did God tell you were image bearers, not anything like that. He challenges them on the basis that they are superior to image bearing. They're higher than that. You can be like the gods, not just a reflection of God. You can be like God, that you're more than an image bearer. And that's, of course, problematic, because what we see is the minute we believe that lie, that we buy into the fact that, you know what, maybe we are superior to that. Maybe we can create our own identity and destiny and purpose and function. We don't have to just reflect God. Maybe, yes, I buy into that. That's what we're called to do. The sad irony is the minute we grasp after superiority to image bearing, we actually become less than human, because then we start to go after what's best for us. We look out for ourselves or our own small community that we've created. Instead of living on an equal plane, as we open up the category of superiority, we begin to treat others as inferior. And there's a selfishness to it. There's a division to it. The inequality comes in. And so what we actually do is we start to fulfill the role that God gave in creation to animals, which is to look out for themselves. That's the instinct that animals have. Humans were given a higher calling, that of image bearing. And so in grabbing for that realm of superiority, we actually rob ourselves of our full humanity, of what we were made to be as image bearers, and we become something less than that. And our experience on earth becomes less than what it is supposed to be as image bearers. So as this narrative goes on, though, we see God with a passion to create a corporate agent, a people, hearkening back to this original call to be a community of image bearers. And it is about that corporate agent. The reality is there are certain things about the nature of God that we cannot reflect on our own, that we can't tell the truth about God and his kindness and his love and his humility and his relational qualities and his willingness to lay down advantages for the benefit of others and all of those truths about God, we can't model those as individuals. We have to be in community to begin to show what human beings are supposed to look like, who God is, and tell the truth about God. And so in Exodus 19:6, we see, for example, God calling for, it says, you will be for me a kingdom of priests. And once again, we see some of those key elements. We see community. You will be a kingdom. We see equality. You will all be priests. There won't be some that are higher or lower. You'll all represent and reflect me. And in so doing, we tell the truth about God, that third element. And so we see that time and time again, those concepts of community, equality, and telling the truth about who God is. I think that's a large portion of in the Ten Commandments, where we're called to not take God's name in vain. And we've reduced that to like a curse word. But I think in the language and context, what that's actually talking about is don't go live in such a way that you defame my name, that you don't tell the truth about who I am by the way that you carry yourselves as a people, as a community. And so there's, I hope that makes sense, but it's those three elements that we see time and time again. In 1 Corinthians 12, when we come to the New Testament, Paul is talking about being the body of Christ. And in chapter 12, all the way through, and even in verse 27, he really gets at that. In fact, let me pull that up and read this really quickly. I wasn't going to, but I've decided that I want to read it really quickly here. So bear with me just for a moment as I turn my phone over to there. Verse 27 says this: now you all, plural, you are the body of Christ, and each one of you is a part. So there is an individuality to image bearing, but the purpose of it is to come together as one body. And his whole point in chapter 12 is that we are creating, God is ordering us to be the restoration of the image bearing humanity, where there is an equality, where there is not those social status games and lies and hierarchies and divisions. And that's really what Paul is addressing in Corinth, is they had let that lie of superiority seep back in through their culture, through their cultural assumptions, which they were blind to, because we usually don't see much about our cultural presumptions and the way we do things. We just think it's normal. And they were mimicking a lot of the lies built on this idea of superiority. And so Paul addresses that in Corinth, and in effect says, you have fallen prey to the schemes of the powers and authorities, and you are no longer being an image-bearing community. You are being a community that looks just like the cultures of the world. And so, in essence, in their corporate life, he's not challenging their salvation. But what he's saying to the community in Corinth is, you're not telling the truth about God. You're not. And in chapter 11, he even comes and he says, when you have communion, when you take the Lord's Supper, you're doing more harm than good, because you're not proclaiming the truth about God. You're divided along social lines and status lines and copying all of those things. And Paul gives example after example in Corinth of how they were doing that. And so what we really see in the New Testament, and there's a lot of different language that applies to this, but one of the ways that it's characterized, and again, there's different terminology in the New Testament, but I think the underlying thought process that really helps us to clarify a lot of the thought and the narrative flow of living out the truth of this image-bearing narrative is if we understand the idea of two realms. And now the Christians of the next generation, by the maybe late first, second, third century, they like to talk about two paths, but it's the same idea, this two realm idea. And we see it, for example, referred to in thought in Galatians chapter 1. And in 4, it says, well, let me pick up in verse 3. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to rescue us from the present evil age, according to the will of our God and Father. And Paul will go on and talk about that and lay out a lot of things in Galatians, which we're not going to get into here. But by the end of Galatians, he contrasts the present evil age with the new creation. So what is he talking about here? He's got two realms in mind. So let me describe them just a bit. Some of you may be familiar with this concept. For some of you, it may be a little bit new. So I'll just try to do it briefly, but be as thorough as I can in my brevity. So the two realms we can think of as two dynamics as well, however you want to word it, but or even two ages. There was the present age, and we see that sometimes the language is the present evil age, this dark age. Sometimes Paul will refer to it as the flesh, and we think he's just talking about our bodies, but he's really talking about the dynamics of this present age and this present realm. And it's characterized, it's ruled over by and influenced on a macro level by the powers and authorities, these forces that work with the nations and lead them astray. And at one time, the Old Testament kind of gives this idea that they were supposed to be the angels of nations and direct those nations towards God and unity. But instead they rebelled, and they, at a macro level, at a cultural, structural, systemic level, have led groups and nations astray from God. And so, in fact, I have some amazing high quality artwork here. I want to demonstrate this. You can think of it with this circle, right? So this is, let me turn it the right way. There we go. So this is the present age. And it is characterized, think of the dynamics of this age. It's characterized by selfish ambition, power, manipulation, looking out for ourselves, all the lies and things that come in when we abandon true image bearing and abandon that equality of image bearing, that community of image bearing. And instead we start to compete. We start to fight over resources. We think that they're limited. We're competitive with one another. We, all of those things, and it leads to division, hate, bombs, bullets, barbed wire, barriers, you name it. It is the present age in which we live, but there are certain dynamics, and it's easy for us to just go, oh, yep, that's all that's sinful and bad. But it's also most of what we know and a lot of what we think is good and how we've been trained to function and get ahead. The dynamics of this world. This is where empire rules. It's where business rules. It's where consumerism rules, and so on. And we're trained by it. I mean, good night. Consumerism is so influential. It's part of the reason why we've become such a hyper individualistic society is follow the money. Consumerism wants to create hyper individualists because those are the kind of people that think I got to be different. I've got to get ahead. I've got all of these things. And so it's run by that consumerism. But this is the age in which we live. Now, one of the things that's interesting then is, there's more artwork. This is like third grade level artwork right here. Sorry, I ripped it. Just ignore that rip. We'll turn it down so you don't see the rip. There we go. This is a different age. And one of the great hopes that we see portrayed in Scripture, especially before the time of Christ, is that this age would eventually, the present age, would give over to this coming age, this future age, the age of God, the age to come. Sometimes Paul will refer to it as the realm of the Spirit, or just the Spirit, and it's characterized by the Spirit. It will be directed by those things, and everything that is anti-image bearing will be gone in this age. It will be, equality, image bearing, love, kindness, patience, peace, all of those things. It will be the world as God designed it. And it makes a lot of sense. And if we're honest, it's not too hard to figure out how to live in this present age. It's just not. I mean, we know how to do it. Again, it's the dynamics of power over, it's success, it's competition, it's getting your share of the pie and then taking as much of it as you can. It's culture wars, it's politics, all those sorts of things. We know how to get ahead in this world. Now, how to live in this world, not that hard to figure out either, because everything's restored, it's renewed, it's perfect, it's beautiful. We're in God's presence. And so there's this constant hope of, I can't wait for this world to fade away so that this one will come. And that makes sense. And if we're living in this world, there's a couple of ways to respond. One is, give me some rules so I know how to not be tainted by the values and dynamics of this age. And we'll just go off in a huddle and we'll stay away from everything and we'll quarantine off until the time comes. And then people can look and go, oh, look, that's a really nice rules to live by. And that's what we tend to want. And it keeps us clean of all of the influence of this age. That's one response. And it's a tempting one. Okay. The other response is the terrifying one, hey, do something, but give me something I like. And then we mill around like, oh man, what does God want from us? What does it look like? What am I supposed to do? What decision am I supposed to make? I'll come back to the third option in a minute. So we have these two realms, and the hope is this one fades away and this one comes. But Jesus kind of messed that all up. And we see this reflected in some of the writings of Paul early on, is the hope was this age would fade away when the Messiah came, when the resurrection came. You would know it. It'd be the end of the world, basically. This world is gone. Here comes this one. We're now in God's presence. We know it. The righteous would be resurrected. God would do away with sin, and the image bearing would be restored. But the New Testament writers actually called Jesus the image of God. And he resurrected. But here's the puzzling thing. This happened, this resurrection, this Messiah, this different coming. But this age was still here. It hadn't gone anywhere. That's puzzling. What do we do with that? So now there's this claim that somehow that future realm is available, but this one's still going on. How do we image in that? How do we be image bearers during that? And this is much of the thought process of the New Testament. I hope you can see this, is there's this overlap. There's this weird, strange overlap coming in where we are still surrounded and living in the present age, but now we've entered into the death of the Messiah, and we've encountered his resurrection life, and we're being restored and renewed in the image of God, into image bearing, but we're still in this realm. So we now become this overlap people. And that's can be confusing. And that's where Paul will address much of his letters, and the other writers as well, of what it means to be an image-bearing people. And here's the challenge. We become a people who live by the dynamics of the new creation while still surrounded by the old creation. And that's where it's so vital that we become an image-bearing people that tells the truth about God. But here's the challenge. Old creation dynamics are very comfortable to us. They're natural. We've been operating in them our whole lives. It's all we know in many respects. And we can become Christians. We can be good, God-fearing members of the church and still operate as a people in the old creation dynamics. Now, one of the ways that this happens, there's a lot of ways, but one of the ways is this is where our individualism gets us. We only think about sin as an individual problem or entity. We don't pay attention to the influence of the powers and authorities, as Paul would say, those things that, yes, there's structural sin, there's systemic sin, there's national sin, there's cultural sin, and these things impact and create inequities and divisions. That's a reality. So we don't tend to pay attention to it. We pay attention to individual sin. And it's very possible for a group of people to be more than sincere and going after sin in our lives and wanting to follow Jesus and wanting to please God and being obsessed with what God's will is, but missing that the primary thing of God's will is be an image bearer. It's that equivalent to just go to Starbucks and within that, get me whatever you want. I'll love it. Be an image bearer. Have the creation and imagination for what the new creation dynamics will look like in this situation, because we can have a church full of individuals, for example, that are trying to be humble people, but we've reduced that to just an individual restoration. And so you have this collection of people that you go and interact with them. And as individuals, they are very humble. But as a group, they're still operating with many of the old creation dynamics. And as a group, the story they tell about God is a not very humble one. As a group, we can act in not humble ways, prideful ways, arrogant ways, because we take scriptures and we only look at them at an individual level, rather than considering them as an image-bearing community. How does this direct us? The Sermon on the Mount, it makes sense for an individual. And we can go after it and be challenged, like, oh, I'm so convicted and challenged. But what about a community? What does it look like for a community to be poor in spirit? Those sorts of things. So let's look at an example here of how Paul plays out. Now, I love that Marty was looking at kind of that narrative flow in Romans. He referenced Romans, and he left off at chapters 10 and 11, which is perfect. Let me pick up in chapter 12, because now he's going to start laying out, hey, this is what a unified image-bearing community is going to look like. This is how we tell the truth about God. And so in Romans chapter 12, verse 1, it says, therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I hope you see the connection. If we're going to be God's people, that community of image bearers, then we're all going to do what? Offer our bodies. Now, who offers sacrifices? Who offers their own body as a sacrifice? But who offers sacrifices? Priests. So here's that community of equity, that community of equals, the kingdom of priests. Here we are. He says, this is what God wants. This is true and proper worship. Pay attention. This is the will of God. It's not, you got to worry about, did you take the right job or did you make the right decision? It's wherever you find yourself, are we being a new creation community? He goes on, verse 2, do not conform to the pattern of this world. Don't implement the old creation dynamics. And again, we can do that so easily. We can have churches. I mean, we can mean so well, but we operate with power over, hierarchy. One of the problems there is our world doesn't do a very good job of distinguishing between power and authority. They've made those one. And I think we are a people to understand that we can have authority without power is off limits to us. Jesus said that don't use power over one another. That's what the Gentiles do. That's what the pagans do. He kept trying to tell people this idea. Power is off limits. So let's read Romans 12 with two things in mind. One, as a people. Okay. Now, of course, there's an individual responsibility element to every aspect of being image-bearing community and of understanding scripture. But I don't think as 21st century Westerners, we're in danger of neglecting that individual aspect. So let's set that aside for just now, because I think that's 99% of the way we tend to read the Bible. Let's read this as with the mindset of what kind of community is this forming us to be? And then how is this showing us new creation dynamics? Like how is it calling us to live that way? And so do not conform to this pattern of the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And the language there implies that it's a constant state of being transformed. He says, then you'll be able to understand what God's will is. Now he goes on in the next section and basically says, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought. We are becoming a body. That's the whole purpose here of what this is doing. And then in verse 9, he starts laying out, here's what God's will and community looks like. Love must be sincere. Now, again, it's easy for me to look at that and go, oh, what does that look like in my own life? But it's a different challenge to go, are we a sincerely loving community? How are we living out the imagination of a new creation? See, it's easier to just get the rules. Hey, here's my Starbucks order, just order this. But that limits us to simple obedience. That's all we can do. You can't demonstrate love. But if there's that call, hey, just go to Starbucks and get me anything. Now I can demonstrate, man, I've been paying attention. I've been learning. I think about you. I want you to try this. We can show love. We can show those sorts of things. Okay. And obviously that analogy falls short. But this is what God wants. He wants a community of image bearing that thinks about what does it mean in this time, in this place, in this situation to tell the truth about God. What does that look like? And that's part of what Marty was getting at with reading in context is how was the wisdom of God being lived out? How is the image bearing lived out in this situation? In fact, I use this example every now and then. Let me give this one because I think this might tie this up, and then we'll get back to Romans and continue on here. My youngest son, came to me at the beginning of the summer, and he had a decision to make. He wasn't sure if he wanted to try to get an internship in his field. He's in college, by the way. He was just finished up his sophomore year in college, and so he had some opportunities to go into an internship. But he also had some opportunities to travel with us to Africa and Europe. And at the time, his college basketball team was going to take a tour in Europe. And so he's weighing all this out. And he asked me for advice. And so I sat down and I said, well, let's talk this through and look at the opportunities and you know, what's best spiritually and down the road and those kind of things and what you want to do and what might be beneficial. And at the end, I said, you know, my advice would be you can do an internship next summer or later or whatever. I would take the opportunity to go on these trips, go to Botswana, go to Paris, go to Spain, do these things, travel. They're kind of unique opportunities that may not come up again. And I think it's a great spiritual opportunity for you, each one of them in a different way. Now, imagine though, if somebody else was in the room and they were listening to that conversation and they said, oh, that's great advice. That's great wisdom. Okay, what do I take away from that? Don't work this summer and travel. Are they following the advice, the wisdom? Yeah, but it wasn't for them. And they might be in a different situation. They might not have parents who have allowed that, or have saved up the kind of money that he had, or it's different opportunities. See, what you've got to do is not just take advice given to him and apply it to yourself. You've got to hear the wisdom of how he's being directed to live out his own story and please God, and then go, okay, now let me take that, the principles of that wisdom, and apply it to my situation, which might be very different. And it might lead to very opposite conclusions than don't work and just travel all summer. But that's how a lot of us approach the Bible. We read it as though it was just written to us instead of for us. And we just take the words out and apply it immediately to our lives. And we don't look at how it's being, how they're being directed to be an image-bearing community in their context, and then go, okay, now what does that mean for us in our context? What are the basics of God's will and image-bearing here? So back to Romans 12. Again, we're looking at this from a community, new creation perspective. Love must be sincere. Hey, what's evil? Cling to what's good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. That's that idea from 1 Corinthians 12 of lifting up those who have been oppressed or pushed down or in lower status levels. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 12, I think it's 24 or 25, those with honor need no special treatment. And God has ordered it this way so that we won't have those divisions and hierarchies in the body. We're living out this dynamic. We're lifting up those who've been oppressed. It's at a equality idea of image bearing, not the world's idea of equality, but God's vision of it. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Again, this is to a community. This is how we're to order ourselves. Be joyful in our hope of resurrection. That's what we're focused on. Patient in affliction. Faithful in prayer. So there again, I've seen individual Christians who can be very patient in affliction. Man, I'm going through tough times. I'm patient. I'm this and that. But then as a people, the culture wars start going on and we start hollering about our rights and this and that. And I'm not doing that. And you can't make me. And we don't tell the truth about God as a community. We're not reading this as an image-bearing community. Verse 13, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Hospitality in the ancient world, to boil it down, was sharing the privilege that I had with those who didn't have it. Do we look like that as a community? Do we bless those who persecute us? Bless and do not curse. We fail in that a lot of times. Do we rejoice with those who rejoice? Mourn with those who mourn? Do we live in harmony with one another? This is a dynamic inside the community and outside of it, right? Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position, low status, the marginalized. Do we do that as a community? Do not be conceited. As a community, do we come across conceited? What does that even mean? What does that look like? How do we come across as a humble community? These are all questions from this text. And Paul is challenging in the Roman context, in Rome, the church in Rome, to do this. So we've got to take and fire up that new creation imagination and say, what does this look like for us? Do not take revenge, my dear friends. We're down to verse 19 now, but leave room for God's wrath. It's mine to avenge. And so he goes on, if your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him something to drink. Don't be overcome evil with, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I'm just hitting some of the highlights here. This is what it looks like to be the new creation, image-bearing people in this realm surrounded by the old creation. We will constantly be drawn to old creation dynamics. In the present age, it's easier and more efficient to lead with old creation dynamics. It's very tempting to start to look at our image bearing communities, our churches, and go, we gotta grow, we gotta have success, we gotta do those things, and then turn to old creation dynamics. But the challenge of image bearing is to stay in that overlap, be that overlap people, tell the truth about God's nature and say there are certain things that are just off limits for us. Power over others, competition, those sorts of things, looking out for our own interests, our rights, those are off limits for us. He says violence and vengeance, those are off limits for us. These are not areas that we get to grab onto. These are not tools that we get to use. These are the weapons of the present age, the dynamics of the old creation. So we've got to start to look in those terms like, well, can we take part in politics? To the degree that we can do so and remain with new creation dynamics, absolutely. But the minute it starts to veer into the old creation dynamics of division and hierarchy and us versus them and you're an idiot and you don't know what you're doing and let's get power and all those sorts of things that are pretty endemic to politics, that's off limits for us. Now, Paul demonstrates this. He continues on in verse 13. Now, in chapter 12, he's been laying out, here's what an image-bearing community in essence looks like. This is how we offer our bodies as that kingdom of priests. This is how we do it. And now he's still addressing. So think of these two realms, because now he's going to start referencing that red realm, that old creation realm. Because here's the tendency, human nature. Oh, okay. So we're no longer the old creation realm. We're now this overlap where the new creation is breaking in. Let's get rid of the old creation. Let's, if we got to seize power and make them live new creation, we'll do it. But the minute we take power, for example, that's an old creation dynamic. We're no longer a new creation people. The minute we grab power, we've now moved back into that old creation realm. But as I said, there's that temptation. Then we just got to get rid of the old creation. Let's just wipe out the government and create a theocracy. Let God be in charge. The problem with creating a theocracy is we always want to be the theo part of it. And we think we know what that looks like. So Paul clarifies this and he says, let everyone, this is the image-bearing community, be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except that which God has established. Here's the reality. There is still this age. We still live in it. And God has allowed there to be governments and nations and authorities, empire even. There's no New Testament order to go that says go wipe out empire. In fact, what Paul says here in these 7 verses is God has allowed empire to exist. He's allowed these authorities to exist. They even have the sword. Their role is to keep peace to a certain degree. That's what they're supposed to do in the present age. And so in a weird sort of way, we actually need that to exist to create the space for our overlap community to show a different way. So let empire and be the counter narrative. Tell the truth about God. Invite people into this different realm, but it's not ours to crash and burn the governing realm. It's also not ours to start taking the dynamics from that realm to get ahead. I hope that makes sense. We're limited to new creation dynamics. That's why Jesus says, love your enemies, because we are from this overlap period of image bearing, the future age where there are no enemies. There is no hate. There is no vengeance. There is no violence. So there is no power. There is no competition. So, there is no getting offended. So those things are off limits to us. We have to be a community that bears the name of God, that lives up to our calling. And he goes on in verse 8, after saying, hey, this is that realm. Let that realm be that realm, but we've got to be our realm. And he says in verse 8, let no debt remain outstanding except the continuing debt to love one another. For whoever loves others has fulfilled the law. That's what we're called to be. Now he gives this great metaphor, and I'll end with this in verse 11 of still in Romans 13. And he says, and do this, and keep in mind here again these two realms, this present age, the darkness, and the future, the new creation, the coming light, the spirit realm. Understanding the present time. The hour has already come for you to wake up from your slumber, because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. Now continue reading this into verse 13 as the metaphor that it is. Let us behave decently, as in the daytime, not in carousing and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and debauchery, not in dissension and jealousy. He's not giving a sin list here. What he's doing is he's using this metaphor of the darkness of the present age. And what do people do in the middle of the night? There's two stereotypical options. One is sleep, and the other one is wake up and get up to no good. Now, I know in practical terms, there's more options than that, but we're talking in metaphor here. So Paul lays out as like, what do people do at night? Sexual immorality, drunkenness, debauchery, all of the dissension, all of that stuff that's characteristic of the nighttime. He goes, that's the age you live in. Don't take part of the old creation dynamics. Don't give into that, but also don't curl up and go to sleep and just wait to be rescued out of this age. He says, here's what it looks like to be an image-bearing community. Wake up. The daytime is coming. You're still in the dark. It's still 2 a.m, but get up and start living as though it's noon. Live a different way. Live a counter narrative. Show people what it looks like to live in the middle of the day, because they've never really seen it before. They've not seen an image-bearing community. And the minute we get sucked back into old creation dynamics, image-bearing community is gone. We're no longer telling the truth about God and who God is. So we'll stop there. There's more that we could say, but hopefully that's given us a little window into the concept from a community aspect of image bearing in the New Testament. Hey, let me briefly say, we're going to have a break here, a 10-minute break, and our next speaker is going to be Nadine Templar. She's amazing, amazing speaker. After the break, I'm going to come back for a few minutes and introduce Nadine more thoroughly and appropriately, and let her take it from there. So please, we'll take about a 10-minute, 12-minute break here, and then we will come back and continue with this image-bearing conference. Thank you so much.